Assalamu alaikum, folks. Welcome to SIA Conversations. As you know, SIA is an organization that has been formed mainly to develop a Pakistani narrative and to continue to do the economic research that we did at PIDE, which unfortunately has suffered. But nevertheless, we will do the SIA Conversations, and we've done many of them, and we do them with everybody that we can get hold of, including Pakistanis, foreigners, everybody, just to try and understand, A, the world, but mostly it's on Pakistan. We want to understand what's happening in Pakistan and why it's happening. And one of the reasons that we do that is because our TV is absolutely, our media is not interested in economics, which is very sad, but there it is. Our media is just not interested in economics. And neither is our government. Our government is also not interested in economics. To them, economics is only borrowing and begging. But that's my view. I won't hold that up to anybody else. That's just my view. So today, I'm very glad. I want to welcome my friend Tobias Haque from the World Bank. Tobias is, I think, well known in Pakistan. He's done a lot of work in Pakistan. He's been in Pakistan for, I think, about 4 years now. And he knows Pakistan very well. He's done some important work in Pakistan. For example, he did the Public Expenditure Review, which we'll talk about. He's also worked at the Country Partnership Strategy that we'll also talk about. The main purpose of this interview is really to find out more about the economy of Pakistan. And since the World Bank is a major researcher in Pakistan, we are going to understand from Tobias what the World Bank researches on Pakistan and what their views are and what their thoughts are and how they advise the government. So with that, let me welcome Tobias.
Thank you
Tobias,
very much,
welcome to SIA Conversations. Tobias, let me begin by asking you first on the Public Expenditure Review. I think to me, that's the most important thing in the country because our expenditures keep increasing, never come down. And my former organization, IMF, keeps imposing more taxes on us. So please tell us, what did you find in the Public Expenditure Review?
So it's a very pertinent point, and I think that this is really what we've seen. I mean, I think especially since the 18th Constitutional Amendment and the National Finance Commission Award, we've seen this structural increase in the fiscal deficits for the federal government. So the primary deficit has really gone up. And what's driven that is that a lot of the revenues with the National Finance Commission Award were, as we all know, pushed down to the provincial level. But the level of spending by the federal government just didn't decline. So what the federal government has found itself doing is continuing to provide all of the services, all of the functions, both through the development and the recurrent budget that it used to be providing, whereas it is now also diverting 57.5% of revenues to the provinces to provide, in many cases, exactly those same set of services. So that's a big part of this problem. I think we've also had big problems on the expenditure side recently with very high subsidy spending. And what we've seen is very high energy subsidy spending, which was really being provided in a very untargeted way. So very large subsidies, but they were going to a very broad range of consumers across the income distribution. And there's a few problems with that. I mean, firstly, it's just very inefficient spending. You're subsidizing some of the better off, and the high energy consumers tend to be the better off. But it's also an economic distortion, and that you're subsidizing the price of a good that can be very polluting. It's not necessarily a good that produces broad social benefit. So not necessarily the kind of good that you want to be encouraging the consumption of. A third area where we saw continued very high spending was in state-owned enterprises. So we see continued both direct subsidies of state-owned enterprises, but also on lending to state-owned enterprises that don't really have the capacity to repay, and a very soft budget constraint on state-owned enterprises. So if they do find themselves in financial trouble, they get perpetual bailouts from the government. So I think those are kind of three key areas where we saw that there was scope for reform. I think potentially another interesting point was that we didn't see Pakistan having necessarily a very large public service in terms of the number of employees relative to countries at similar levels of income, or a very large government footprint in terms of overall GDP share of the economy. So For us, it was saying that there's a lot of areas where the government can improve the quality of its spending. It can make spending more progressive and more efficient. But the top priority shouldn't necessarily be to cut spending entirely. And I should also say, sorry for speaking for so long, but I should also say that I think government's made a lot of progress in some of these areas since we put out that report a few years ago. So I think under the National Fiscal Pact, agreed recently with the IMF and the provinces, there's been a real agreement that the federal government will get out of some of these areas where the provinces should be taking the lead. There's been a real reform on the energy sector. So electricity subsidy, there's still, I think, a very long way to go. But you've really seen a focus now on directing subsidies to the protected consumers. So the consumers who are most in need, those people who are consuming the least below the threshold. So really essentially trying to find ways of providing subsidies more to the poor residential consumers than anyone else.
Very good summary, very good summary. But let me ask you a couple of questions. You said the footprint is not very large. Well, it's in direct contradiction to what we know. The footprint to our minds is about 80% of GDP. Now, I don't know, maybe there's differences of measures, but the point is we include the cost of, not the cost, sorry, the direct intervention of government in various spaces. For example, if the government interferes in agriculture, then we take that as a footprint of the government. I mean, the government buys wheat, obviously, then the government sets the prices. If the government is the major construction agency, we take that as a footprint of the government. So I think, quite frankly, I don't know how you measure footprint. To us, the footprint is huge, and especially when you take into account the footprint in the cities. The cities, the government totally controls and has these lovely, beautiful palaces in. You live next to them. So please tell me, how is the footprint small?
So no, listen, I don't, okay, so firstly, I don't think we said it was small. I think we said that it doesn't seem out of line with international comparatives. But I think your key point is we're using very different measures of footprint. And we're using a very basic measure. We're saying how much does government spend as a proportion of GDP? And how many people does it directly employ as a proportion of the population? Right? These are very, very narrow measures. You're talking, I think, about a much more important measure and potentially a much more relevant measure, which is to say, how does government spending distort the economy? How does it impact prices? How does it impact resource flows in ways that can be very negative? And I would completely agree. We haven't tried to quantify that. And I think Pied's research on that was very, very useful. So we're using different measures. I mean, the only point I wanted to make was this is not a situation where you see the government is spending way too much and needs to cut spending as an end in itself. I think what we're saying is that government is spending not particularly efficiently in many ways, and especially when it is spending in ways that distort the economy or distort prices or distort resource allocation, that can do an enormous damage. So I think we agree.
So the government is not spending a lot. The government is spending 22% of GDP. And the government is also has a huge amount of leeway to spend wherever it likes. I mean, for example, the government can set up an agency like this. I think they've set up in this year alone about 15 new agencies. Is there a process after you do a public expenditure review? How difficult is it to set up a new agency? How difficult is it to close an agency? For example, the government has never closed an agency. Key point, for example, I'll give you. Imran Khan put up near Pakistan Housing Authority. It still exists. But we put up, and the World Bank is a part of it, a housing authority in Punjab. Now, do we need a housing authority for a start? And secondly, we've got two housing authorities now roaming around. We've got another one, the traditional one. So we've got three housing authorities. We've got about 20 energy agencies. You were talking about energy subsidy, we'll come to that. But we've got about 20, 30 energy agencies that are going nowhere, and we are setting up two new ones. So I think the government has a huge amount of leeway to spend more. There seems to be no budget constraint. Secondly, take the PSTP. The PSTP is a disaster. They're building so many things that they shouldn't be building. And did you take that into account? Should the PSTP exist? By the way, I've been on record. I said this in 2011, 2012. I wrote a book on this 2017. The PSTP should go now. The Planning Commission should be put out of business. What do you think?
So look, I think there's a lot there. I mean, I think that there's no doubt that we have a proliferation of agencies. We have a very complex government structure. We have a lot of redundancy in the structure of government. And you know, we're working with the finance minister at the moment on the government right-sizing activity. I think it's too early to say how much success we're going to have with that. But certainly, I think the work that's being done is showing just how many agencies exist, how many of those agencies have an unclear public good mandate, how many of those agencies are overlapping with the work that's been done with other agencies, and how many of those agencies could be outsourced either to the private sector entirely, they could be privatized, they could be devolved to the provinces in many cases as well. We are well overdue for a very, very hard look at the structure and administrative system of government here. And I think that your question about, you know, should there be checks and balances in place? Should we have a legislative structure or a regulatory impact assessment that needs to be done before the creation of a new government agency? I think those are thoughts very worth further consideration. I mean, I worked in the New Zealand government for years. There we have a regulatory impact statement before any major government decision. And it's not just talking about the government spending impacts. It's talking about the economic distortions, the long-run economic costs of establishing any agency or passing any regulation. And I think we really need to start thinking in those terms rather than just the simple cost-benefit analysis. And sometimes, frankly, even that's not done. I think, as we both know very well.
This is the year 2025. And we're going to begin to think about these things. I mean, look, my point is, I was a young boy learning economics when I heard about right-sizing the government. I was a very young boy when I heard about deregulating wheat. I was a very young boy when I heard about deregulating the energy sector. And we are still thinking about it. We've still got committees and the World Bank is advising. I think the World Bank should take some responsibility and get this right. Now, moving on. What about energy? You said there is an energy subsidy. I say there isn't. Where is the energy subsidy? Are we putting in all our losses and inefficiencies in the subsidy? Quite frankly, the energy bills have skyrocketed in this quest for closing down subsidies. Now, please tell me where the subsidies are.
Well, so it's a great question, right? And I think it's a question that really unpacks this issue very well. Why do we have energy subsidies? Why do we have this strange situation where we have high subsidies and also very high energy costs?
The point is, we have energy subsidies. It is the losses that the energy system is making,
exactly.
Which is bureaucracy.
The inefficiencies within the system.
Strikes to fold into the losses into the subsidies. Why do you guys buy it? I mean, we have to buy it. We've got no choice. I'm going to pay my bills. But why does the World Bank buy it? Why does the World Bank not call it what it is? The losses of the energy sector, they refuse to fix the transmission distribution. They refuse to fix the metering system. They refuse to close down agencies. They refuse to close down overhiring. They refuse to get rid of meter readers. Then we have subsidies.
No, so listen, I think if you read the new World Bank country strategy, you will see very clearly that we are under no illusions of the extent of reform that is required in the energy sector. And look, I'm not an energy sector expert, I'm not an engineer, but from an economic perspective, it's very clear. What we have is essentially a system where you have major electricity losses. So you have technical losses, you have billing losses, and that is a function of the institutional problems within the electricity sector. And what we've seen is, as we've attempted to close those losses through increasing energy prices, to recover those losses by increasing energy prices, we found ourselves in a bit of a spiral, because the higher the prices go, we've seen reductions in demand, we've seen people moving off the grid, and that basically means that your fixed costs have to then be spread across a narrower number of consumers or a narrower base of production, and that pushes the price up. So we're in the spiral. The only way to break that spiral is to get to the structural cause of your high energy price, which is the economic costs within the system. We need to get away from this accounting approach and trying to balance the books and actually say, look, why do we have these high costs in the first place? And as you say, I mean, there's a number of steps that need to happen there. First and foremost, we need to fix the state-owned enterprises, and probably privatizing the state-owned enterprises is the best way to go with that. That changes the incentives structure within those within the distribution companies, and creates an incentive for them to collect the tariff and to operate efficiently. But there's bigger issues. Well, there's the transmission network structure, there's the generation structure. We need to change the incentives in the system so that those cost drivers start to be addressed.
Yeah, Tobias, you remember I was the deputy chair of the Planning Commission and the Minister of Planning in 2010. I remember we were sitting in the director of the IMF Middle Eastern Department, Masood Ahmed's room, and the committee room. The World Bank was there too. And I was representing the Pakistani side, and we had other people. And it came to the energy sector. And once again, the IMF, and Masood, as you know, is a good friend, turned around and said, hey, increase prices. So I said, look, okay, increase prices, but tell me, what are we going to do about the energy sector? And the IMF turned around and said, no, the World Bank will do it. So I said, please, at least give me one pager on what the World Bank is going to do. And we never got it. Now, my issue is, we've written a whole book on this, and you've seen it in the invite. To me, it's very simple. Energy is a governance problem. And I remind you that the Nobel Prize last year was won by Acemoglu, etc. And previous 5 or 6 Nobel Prize winners have said the same thing. It's institutional reform. Yeah. Energy is an institutional reform problem. Energy, there's no other problem. They set up these plants that were unnecessary at a huge cost without due analysis, right? And now they want to pass on the cost to us. They signed the IPPs when there was no reason to sign IPPs. People like me have been yelling for the last 20 years, forget the IPPs, it's over. But they don't want to do that. They want to get more IPPs. Secondly, they set up inefficient IPPs. They gave wind power a huge amount of energy, which is very sporadic. They gave their solar plants a huge amount of this thing. At the same time, they never invested in the grid. At the same time, I remember being yelling about this. We've been writing about this, yelling about this for the last 15 years. Hey, give us smart meters. We still haven't got, we still got the old meters. We've still got the meter reader who comes to our houses and asks for a bribe. And everybody knows that. It's not as if it's not known. But we can't fix the system because the secretary wants to keep the system under his thumb. The minister wants to keep the system under his thumb. The discos have no independence. The disco official is a grade 20 official. What do you expect? There's no expertise in the disco. They don't want expertise in the disco. Financial management, discos can't keep any of their capital. They have to give it to the Ministry of Finance that very evening. How can you run a system like that? So is it not a problem? Is it a technological fix or an institutional problem?
It's an institutional problem. And I think if you ask, I mean, the World Bank, I think, has been very clear on this. If you look at our policy notes from last year, if you look at all of the analysis we've been doing in the energy sector, we are saying you need sweeping institutional reform. It's absolutely clear. And I think that, you know, we actually had a budget support operation that did not go ahead because the institutional reforms were not going ahead.
No, but
now, the question then is,
reforms. How specific are you? See, the problem is written these reports. When we said we need institutional reform, we were hiding things. Well, how specific are you guys?
So okay, if you look at the Pakistan Development Update from, I think it was October last year, we gave some very clear recommendations for distribution company reform.
Tell me.
And essentially what we were saying is that, yes, you need to privatize distribution companies, and there's a very clear way of doing that effectively. But you need to do much more about market structure. You need to make sure that your distribution companies actually have financial management systems in place, that they understand their own asset base, that they have the financial management capacity in place to operate effectively. So there is a roadmap there. There is some quite technical detail about how to implement this in a structured way, about lessons from other countries. I would encourage anyone watching this to look that up. So I think, look, between PIDE's work and the World Bank's work, I don't think that there's a lack of technical knowledge on how to do this. I think that the problem much more is about whether there's the political will to push it through. And maybe you disagree. Maybe you think we need another big World Bank report on this. But I mean, for me, this work has been done.
Yeah, I don't need a big World Bank report. I think we need far more clarity. I think, as I said, you've written the reports. I've written them for a lifetime. I've written them all the time. We know how to cover up things, inter alia, among other things, and this, that, etc. When I used to work at the fund, we used to hide poverty under the covers. But now fund has become a poverty institution that's changing times. When I used to write the fund reports, we used to hide climate change as was half a paragraph or something. Now it's become a climate agency. So these things change. But the point is we know how to hide them. We know how to bring them out. But let's move on. Let's move to your country partnership. Now, give me the underlying framework, the theoretical basis, and what exactly is it that you bring out in that?
So look, I mean, I think the core underlying logic of the country partnership framework is that Pakistan has first and foremost, and I know you hate this term, but a human capital problem, right? So we are saying essentially that with 80% learning poverty, so kids being unable to basically read an age-appropriate text, if we have 40% stunting rates, if we have very high prevalence of communicable and non-communicable disease, if we have very low life expectancy, if these basic abilities of human beings are being undercut so significantly by exposure to lack of access to services and exposure to very harmful environmental conditions, then we are not going to be able to realize the capacity of Pakistan. We're not going to realize the potential of Pakistan. So it's that, how do we get the people capable, engaged, healthy, educated, so that Pakistan really can meet its enormous potential? And so the first the first priority in the country strategy is stunting. It's talking about how we need a really coherent multi-sector approach. It's not just about nutrition. It's about nutrition, but it's also about sanitation, and it's also about access to healthcare. How do we bring those things together to address the stunting crisis? It's about early childhood education. How do we make sure that kids go to school, but also that they learn something when they're at school, which is often the bigger challenge. Actually that school quality, that education quality. There's also a focus on, I think, given that we're looking at an era of increased climate change risk, it's talking about resilience. We use this term resilience, but essentially what that means is, how do we make sure that if there's an economic shock or a climate shock or a natural disaster, that communities and households have some mechanisms to respond to that, to bounce back, and that doesn't become a disastrous shock that sends households into a negative spiral of negative coping mechanisms. There's one pillar on energy transition and basically increasing the efficiency of the energy sector, but also moving towards a lower carbon energy sector. And then there's the final two priorities are in my area. One is on basically increasing public resources available for inclusive development, which means both increasing revenues, but also increasing the quality of government spending. And then finally, there is enabling private sector development, right? So I know that goes at the end. That's just a presentational choice. I don't think it's about the priority. But the point there is that ultimately, the way we will increase incomes is by increasing private sector investment, by having private sector-led development. That will put the money in people's pockets to access the the kind of services that they need, and it will put the revenue in the government's pocket to provide the services that are required. So it's across the spectrum. It's still a broad strategy, but I think it's much, much narrower than it's been in the past. And I think the key innovation is that we're moving from a 3-4 year strategy towards a 10-year strategy. And the point of that really is to say that these are big challenges, and the World Bank wants to be allocating its resources to a small number of big challenges over a long-term time frame, so that we have that continuity, so that we have that sustained impact, and that we don't end up fragmenting our resources across what frankly are often quite rapidly changing government priorities. So the idea, very frankly, is to kind of put a bit of an anchor over the long term in terms of what we will be processing, what we'll be thinking about, what we will be prioritizing.
Very interesting. Very interesting. A number of questions arise, but we won't have the time to take them up. One is, these are all targets or wishes. And by the way, I'm not against human capital. I studied with Gary Becker, as you know. Gary Becker was the father of human capital.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think all I say is, I think we apply the term wrongly. I think it's become a wish list. It's become like a scripture. We mouth human capital, everybody says, amen, amen, amen. Human capital, as Gary Becker said, very simple, is my investment in myself.
Exactly.
And a return at the end. If there's no return, there's no human capital. So what we are trying to do is educate kids without a return, which I find is cruel. We are giving them a single national curriculum and giving them a lot of ideological bullshit, which will not be useful to them. And eventually they'll end up unemployed. Case in point, the other day, I was some people like you, donor consultants, donors don't talk to me, but donor consultants. And we were having lunch at the Islamabad Club. So I called the waiter and I said, my friend, what is your education? He said, I'm a BA. So I said, how about the other people? He said, most of them are BAs. So I told them, this is the return on education. And we looked at the returns on education. Returns to education are very small if you take out the government, right? The government is the largest employer of people. And you said the government is small, but no, the government employs 3 million people. 3 million people, why the hell is it small? And when you say the government expenditures are small, we've looked at government expenditures. The bureaucrats are very clever. They don't measure their expenditures other than salaries. When you put in those expenditures, you get a really different figure. I wish you'd done that in the public expenditure review. But these are all instruments. These are all sort of wishes. What are the instruments and how does it gel with the planning? Planning Commission has a wish list too. It has no instruments too. What I was taught by Tinbergen was, hey, you have to have some instruments to get there. So what are your instruments?
Yeah, so look, I mean, as I say, I am not an education specialist, and I'm not a healthcare specialist, I'm not a nutrition specialist at all. But you know, I think some of the core logic here is essentially that we have to get back to, I think, some of the kind of fundamentals of economics. We need to make sure that we are aligning, for example, in the stunting agenda. I think it's making sure that we actually understand the linkages between the causes of stunting, how sanitation impacts, how behavior impacts, how access to healthcare impacts. And we need to have a strategy that brings those interventions together in geographically specific ways with a very clear intervention logic. And that's something that the World Bank can provide an anchor for, and it's something that the World Bank can provide significant financing for. But we really need this to be a broader strategy that applies to government activity as well, and also applies to the activities of other development partners and other people working in even the basic services space, whether that's NGOs or humanitarian actors or others. So it's saying that one intervention is not going to get us there. We need to have a coherent program of interventions. We have to have a clear intervention logic. It has to be sequenced. It has to be geographically targeted. So I think on nutrition, I think there's a lot there. And I think, again, I mean, referring back to our our policy notes of last year, you can see quite a clear kind of articulation of the strategy that we need to apply in that space. Education and health, I mean, I think that there's big allocative efficiency problems. I think we're clear on that. I think that we need to really be prioritizing resources towards the primary education, and that's what the World Bank has said. That's why we focused on primary education, because the bang for buck on that is very important. And if just like you say, if children come out of the education system without some of those core capacities, they're not going to be well equipped to absorb further education, and they're also going to be ill equipped for the labor market. So focusing on core literacy, core numeracy, these very core skills that are the foundational skills for broader education development. Healthcare, I mean, I think that, again, I mean, I think basically getting the core primary healthcare system functioning is going to be really important. And how to do that? I mean, I think that there's a couple of things there. I mean, I think that we have a public finance system that isn't particularly well targeted at the moment. It doesn't provide good information in terms of where money is going. We have a lot of private provision of healthcare at the province level, especially in Sindh, for example, where you have a kind of quasi-NGO providing much of the primary healthcare clinic care. We need to make sure that government-funded, non-government delivered healthcare is being made much more accountable, that there's a results-based component potentially, and that the government knows what it's getting for every dollar that's being spent. And finally, sorry if I'm, again, speaking so long, but I think there's a lot here. I mean, I think finally we need to get at some of these provincial-federal coordination issues as well. What actually is the role of the provincial government? What is the role of the federal government? How do we make sure that there's clarity in terms of who is doing what there? And I think as well, I mean, I keep coming back to this. When you think about service delivery in a country like Pakistan, it's very unusual that you have the province as your administrative unit, especially in a province the size of Punjab, which would be the 8th largest country in the world if it was a country of its own. So how do we activate local government as a way of understanding human development needs like education needs, healthcare needs, and having a local level unit of administration that can understand those needs, that can allocate resources to those needs. Now, that's a very long-term agenda, but I think these are some of the things that we want to start to get at.
But Tobias, I come back. We are in 2025. The country is 80 years old. When you say long-term, how long do we have to wait? People also have a right to be impatient that, we've done this for a long time and we're getting no results. So quite frankly, I think I'm on Trump's side. We need some change. We need some real change. Now, you're right that, we can have grand targets. And Hassan Iqbal also has Iran, Pakistan, and 5 E's. We've got targets galore. We've got targets everywhere. Prime Minister goes to Belarus. He has tons of targets. I come back to this. Do we have the institutions to deliver those targets? I think not. Secondly, look at our investment. Our private investment is now 8% of GDP, maybe even less, right? This is not even maintenance. This doesn't even cover depreciation. So quite frankly, I think the biggest problem that we've got in investment, even more than stunting, you'll have very healthy children, very well built, very well educated, but they'll become peons and chaprasis because they have no opportunities. Unless there's investment taking place, where is the opportunity going to come from? And I don't see anything from the international agencies telling us that investment should happen and how it should happen. We've got government policy running left, right, and center, doing hundreds of things, building underpasses, building flyovers, destroying this institution, destroying that institution, 122 regulatory bodies in Islamabad, 140 training academies in Islamabad, Prime Minister traveling everywhere, Prime Minister giving out subsidies everywhere. Even the cell phone now is playing a Prime Minister's message. That comes out of public expenditures. It's not free. It's not a free good. 60-page advertisement supplements, that's a public expenditure. How are you going to achieve these things if the private sector is not investing and the government has no sagacity to invest and no capacity to invest? You mentioned local government. Hey, where's local government? There's no local government in this country. We are still asking for local government. And this is a highly centralized government. I don't know whether you've seen our research on the principal accounting officer or not. Principal accounting officer, there are 5 people who control the whole country. Do you think that's a good model for investment? Should people invest in this country? So where do you address the investment issue? I don't want to put you on the spot for answering that question. Where do you put investment in the country partnership strategy?
So, like, I mean, I think there's a few things there. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. But one thing I want to be very clear on is that I don't think we're shying away from saying that institutional reform is needed. I mean, I think in all of the areas that we've been talking about, whether it's human capital, whether it's private sector investment, whether it's the efficiency of government, whether it's the electricity sector, we need institutional reform more than anything else in this country. But I mean, I think the question then is how do you get there, right? And what should we? I'd be interested in your thoughts. What should we be doing to get towards those institutional reforms? I don't think that we're ignoring the need for institutional reform. On your investment question, where's the investment going to come from? Like, where should it go? Look, I mean, I think it's very simple what the government needs to do here, and we've said this many times, and we've said it again in the CPF. Firstly, the government needs to open the economy. We have an economy that is heavily protected. No country has ever got rich by hiding between projections. Nearly every successful case of rapid economic development in the past 50 years has been through countries finding opportunities to integrate into global supply chains. We're never going to be able to do that if we have very high tariffs, if those tariffs apply to intermediate goods, if we're distorting the economy by saying which sectors need to compete and which sectors don't need to compete, and we're creating an enormous incentive for firms to sell to the domestic market because they don't have to compete against imports, rather than sell to the world and have to compete and have to be efficient and have to adopt leading edge modern technologies. So number one, we've got to open the economy. We've got to do something about these trade protections. And some of that work is, again, it's being talked about, it's being planned, but we need to see it happen. We need to get past the talking and we need to get to the doing. The second point, we have 40% of GDP roughly in the asset base of just the federal state-owned enterprises, 200 state-owned enterprises. How are you going to attract investment into an economy when it is so dominated by the public sector? When for every private sector company, there's a public sector company that is getting subsidies to do the same thing. So we need to get the state-owned enterprises out. We need to do a very hard look. We need to just cut the state-owned enterprises that don't have a very, very clear public sector rationale. And we need to let the private sector take up that space where we know from international experience they'll be more efficient and more effective. And the third thing, like just very, very quickly, the third thing, we need to ease the business enabling environment, right? I mean, and this is not trivial. This is like, we have something like 40 agencies regulating who can start a business, which certification they need, which paperwork they need. This needs to be cut.
122 agencies, not 40.
Okay.
And I would also like to add, many of them created by the World Bank. Many of them World Bank. I mean, the one thing, do you take responsibility for the agencies that you guys create and never evaluate? Competition Commission, for example. I remember Eric and I had a big debate on that. I remember we had a big debate on FDA. All these agencies that all these agencies that the World Bank created. Or for example, another thing, you've created a mortgage refinance corporation. I don't know why. You've created a commodity exchange in Karachi that has not worked for the last 30 years. It trades gold. I mean, for God's sakes, these things take government expenditure and we never talk about them.
So listen, I think, look, the easy answer is to say, well, look, the World Bank supports the government in its own agendas, and if the government wants to come up with an intervention in a particular sector and they ask the World Bank for support, it's our role to provide that support. I think that's the wrong answer. I think that it's probably, if we are doing a thorough review of public agencies, we should absolutely be including those agencies the World Bank has been involved in, and other development partners have been involved in that review. And those agencies where we can't clearly say that they are addressing a public good problem, that they don't have a public sector rationale, or that the costs outweigh the benefits, they should be on the chopping block along with anything else. We are not saying that there should be any special treatment for the entities that the World Bank has been involved in. And I think we would love to be involved in this kind of review. I think this is exactly the kind of review that would be needed.
You asked me what I would recommend. I would recommend that the World Bank should be clearer in its recommendations and be less keen to lend. Same thing that I tell the IMF. Please don't lend. We don't need your money. I mean, the people are saying we didn't need your money, but the government needs the money. I think there is a dichotomy here that we should think about. And I don't know who's the World Bank responsible to, the government or the people. So I mean, that's also something that has to be thought through. But again, we won't answer that. The key issue is you talk about sanitation, for example, behavior. All this is institutional change that we need to do. Does the government even have the capacity to do this, or is the World Bank providing the capacity to do that? Because if you are providing the research and the capacity to do the work, then it's a different responsibility that the World Bank has to take. And I think World Bank should shoulder that responsibility that, hey, you can't be this. Then it comes down to Taleb's problem, Nassim Taleb's problem. Where is the skin in the game? So, I mean, in the sense, if you give these recommendations with no skin in the game, and also the financing, 10-year financing. The government loves the financing. They love the financing. They can take free trips. They can build more houses. They can have more cars. I mean, for example, we never see in any of the donor recommendations, which country gives officials cars and houses? Know any? Does New Zealand do that? Does Australia do that? Does England do that? Does anybody do that? Now, we write about it and I become the bad boy because I write about it, right? Yet the international agencies never mention this. Is it not a problem? We've calculated that they control 80% of GDP in these things. For example, downtown real estate is the most expensive in the world, right? I don't know, I can give you references. Dag Netter, read his book, or Vito Tanzi did this paper in the fund, that look, downtown real estate has value. It is an asset that the country has, and we never try and unleash it. We tell the bureaucrats, you can have more money to do this, right? Secondly, the bureaucrats run the whole place. Where is the research on stunting? Who did the research on stunting?
So the World Bank, I mean, the World Bank's done a lot of research, but I think there's a lot of research done by PI. I think that there's research being done by academics.
Do you think there should be local research on subjects, or it should all come from the World Bank?
Of course, there should be local, and there is local research, and we use that research. And a lot of the work that we're doing is administered by local researchers as well.
No, you're saying.
I mean, look, I think just to come back to your bigger question though as well, right? I mean, I think it's very well acknowledged that aid can create perverse incentives. I think there's a lot of literature on that. But at the end of the day, you've got a $350 billion economy, and we're providing maybe $2 billion a year at most. So yes, I mean, maybe we contribute sometimes to the problems. I think often we contribute to the solutions. But I think that, I mean, at some point, yes, maybe there is a perverse incentive that comes from some of the aid support. But it's very hard to say that Pakistan's problems are due to that. I think it's a much deeper issue around the political economy, because frankly, aid is just not that big a part of the picture, right? So I think it's coming back to what we've already been saying, that ultimately it's a governance issue. It's an institutional issue. I think if you look at the World Bank's country partnership framework, you'll see that those institutional, we may not use that language, but those institutional issues very much are in there, and those recommendations for institutional reform. But ultimately, it's going to be about the political will to take up some of those institutional challenges.
So what would be your key recommendations for institutional reform?
Across the board, or in any particular sector?
No, across the board.
Well, look, I'm an economist, right? So I would say that unless we address what is holding back Pakistan's economy, we're not going to have the resources to address the other problem. And so institutionally, then I think that what we need to start with is this comprehensive review of government's footprint in the economy and where it is spending money. And I think that should involve, firstly, the kind of agency level administrative review that we've talked about. If an agency can't demonstrate its public good, if it can't demonstrate that it is doing something that couldn't be done by the private sector, whether that's a government agency or a state-owned enterprise or a quasi-government entity, it should be shut down. There's just no need for that. Government should not be acting purely to create employment. That's not an effective use of government resources. So that's one thing. I think the second should be a thorough review of our tariff policy, our tariff structure. I think that is an institutional problem as well. Who sets tariffs? Why are they set? How do we balance revenue with private sector development needs and investment needs? And I think we need a much lower tariff system. We need a much more open economy. And then thirdly, I think we need to just do a complete, not just the administrative unit review, but the legislative rules, the regulations, the rules of business that regulate private sector activity. And we need to basically get rid of anything that not only doesn't solve some purpose, but imposes costs that are greater than the benefits. So there needs to be a cost-benefit assessment across all of the legislative, the regulatory, the process controls, the certification requirements, the licensing requirements at the provincial level and at the federal level. I think if we were to do those three things, we would see an enormous shift in terms of investment levels, in terms of private sector activity, in terms of the efficiency of the economy. And that would generate resources that would put Pakistan in a much better place to deal with some of the underlying human capital problems as well.
There we agree. But we saw this when I was at my research shows. Sludge, deregulation is the most important subject in the country. Why can't we deregulate? Why have we not deregulated for the last 75, 80 years? Let's get to the root of that. Why have we not deregulated? There is one group in the government that doesn't want to deregulate. There is one group in the government that controls all the power, that has all the benefits. And this group used to do research in the old British India days. If you go to the India Office Library, there's a lot of research. Today, there's no research in the government. There is no research in the government at all. The only paper that comes out of the government is the economic survey. Other than that, there's no paper that comes out of the government. All policies are almost donor-driven. There's no policies that there are. There are projects like SEED, Karandas, Andaz, Arbaz, hundreds of these projects that run the place. At the same time, there's tons of these consultants that are roaming around. The government has lost all research capacity. The government has no capacity to make policy. The government has no capacity to administer anything. The government has no capacity to monitor anything. It doesn't monitor anything. How do we build those things without necessarily bringing technocracy to the government? One of the reasons that the energy problem exists is there are no real electrical engineers in the Ministry of Power. There are no electrical engineers anywhere in the system. There's a huge amount of brain drain taking place, huge amount of human capital flight, but people are not being employed in the right places. We don't have merit in the system. And those things are important to see. We have to, the training, for example, the training is all wonky. Now, human capital, let's look at human capital. What is the state of our universities? The state of a university is pathetic. We've written papers on this. I've written 3 books on this. We have professorless universities, very clear. There are no professors. We have teachers who are not interested in research. And the government is not interested in talking to the universities. So how do we have human capital? That's why I object to human capital. Human capital is an inert term here, which just says send kids to school with no future. I've got calls from my PhD students, many of them. They're turning to real estate. They're turning to all kinds of things because there's no employment opportunity. How do we solve these problems unless the government steps back, allows... Final thing, most important thing, predictability of policy. There is no predictability of policy right now. They're thinking of changing taxes again. I mean, what a bizarre thing. Last year we increased taxes on salary. This year we're saying we'll drop them. I mean, the finance minister himself should be thinking here, how can I be a finance minister if I'm going to change taxes all the time? Because people have no planning horizon at all. Now, how do we deal with this if every day the government changes its mind? Who's going to invest?
No, I agree. I completely agree. I agree. And I mean, we've been having some good discussions with government about the need for policy predictability, and especially in terms of tax predictability. I think ultimately, I mean, I think this is what Acemoglu and Robinson talk about, right? I mean, ultimately, it's an incentive problem. You have public research universities that are not functioning well. You have state-owned enterprises that are not functioning well. You have a regulatory system that isn't functioning well. You have government policy that is obviously often not functioning well, because the incentives of the people that make those policies and run those institutions are not aligned with the public interest. This is
studied those incentives? What are those incentives?
Sorry, say that again.
Have you studied those incentives? I mean, obviously, you should have studied those incentives. Have you studied those?
Obviously, the World Bank does political economy analysis a lot of the time. I think that, I mean, some of our work really is in thinking about how do you better align those incentives. So what kind of, for example, if a privatization of a state-owned enterprise, if a privatization of a distribution company changes those incentives in a more positive way, which we think it would, if the privatization of an airline changes those incentives in a positive way, which we think it would, that's the kind of change we've been recommending. But ultimately, I think that we know that there are some very high-level incentives in place, and a country as complex and contested as Pakistan that are beyond the realm of development agencies.
But let me ask you this two final questions. How do you interact with Pakistani research? Because our analysis of incentives is very different. I mean, I put out lots of books on this, and many people agree with me. The biggest incentive is the way the government pays people, and that's, I mean, Dixit wrote about it. I mean, Stiglitz, etc. Everything is incentives, it's contract theory, etc. If you use that, what are the incentives of an average civil servant who controls everything? The central controller, the finance secretary, the principal secretary, the commerce secretary, these 5-6 guys who control the whole economy, what are their incentives?
Yeah, no, look, exactly. So I think, I mean, it would be very interesting. I mean, there has been public sector reform. The World Bank has done public sector reform in many countries. It would be very interesting to do that kind of public sector reform analysis in Pakistan. I'm sure the PIDE has done it. Countries have different solutions to these problems. I think that often you end up with performance contracts for secretaries. You end up with government transparency initiatives that make sure that the public is more aware of what's being delivered and what's not being delivered, with the hope that that aligns the incentives of policymakers with the interests of the public. There are a whole range of different incentive mechanisms and institutional structures that can be addressed. I guess the question is whether there's the appetite for the implementation of those kind of reforms.
Tobias, your country is a pioneer in that. New Zealand is a pioneer in that, right? So
exactly.
I mean, we have all learned from the New Zealand reform, and I've used that a lot in my writing. But my question is, when domestic, I mean, you only work with the government of the World Bank, right? You're a government agency. What about, but you also fund some local partnerships, right? You also fund some local NGOs, etc., etc., and you do a lot of interagency funding, like DFID will fund you, you will fund DFID, USAID will fund you, you will fund USAID. So these are all hidden contracts that we don't know about, but they are there. The question is, how do you interact with local thought? I mean, many of us have been talking about this, that look, the incentives of the civil service has to change. The civil service reform has to happen. Decentralization has to happen. Universities have to acquire independence. Universities have to be, if you want human capital, We want universities to be independent. Not that the minister can change people as he likes. Minister can put his favorite friend in there. Minister can put his favorite whatever in there. And not that the ministers can do whatever they like, or the civil servants can do whatever they like. Change the chairman NEPRA and put whoever you like. Change the PIA head and put your favorite friend in there. This has been the problem. It's not so much privatization. Look, I come from the University of Chicago. I'm all for privatization. I've been fighting the free market fight here since 1992, or maybe even earlier. The point is, privatization could be a solution, could not be a solution. I remember when we did it in the Soviet Union, privatization created the nomenclature.
Disaster. Yeah. You need the institutions in place first. Exactly.
Here we have the chances. In fact, we have created nomenclature through privatization. The early privatization helped those guys, then IPPs helped those guys. So, I mean, quite frankly, we got the nomenclature here. Why can't we privatize through the stock market, as many of us have been saying? But the World Bank doesn't want to do that. Now, my question is not to talk about the World Bank. My question is, how do you interact with local thinkers? And how do you empower local thinkers to be reformers? Because I think, quite frankly, is the role of the World Bank to stifle local thinking, or is it to empower local thinking to champion reform?
So look, I mean, obviously, we would like to think that we are encouraging local research and we're drawing on local research. And I think that every concept review meeting that we have at the World Bank now, we require local researchers to be present at that meeting. My team is contracting a wide range of local researchers now on a whole range of different topics that we're researching, political economy of public finance. We have research ongoing through stunting. We have research ongoing regarding the impacts of the 22 floods. All of this is being done by local research institutions, and we are financing that. I think we had a very good partnership a couple of years ago, Nadeem, working with some of your colleagues, basically thinking about how we could go out to universities, how we could hear from universities, how we could make sure that our reform agenda was reflecting what was local knowledge. But we're always open to suggestions about how we can do this better. And I think any research institution that wants to get in touch with us and suggest a partnership, we would love to talk.
No, I don't even mean that. Quite frankly, I don't think you should be funding anything. I think the government should be funding things. If the World Bank funds something or somebody funds something, that's wrong. That in itself creates incentive problems, huge incentive problems. And we've all worked for these agencies. I worked for the IMF for 30 years. I've worked for many donor agencies. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. The government should be funding research. But the government funds no research. In fact, what the government does, which is, to me, in my mind, very dangerous, that they want to place their friend somewhere. They'll call the international agency and say, hey, give them a contract and place him here. Now, that happens all the time, and that's very unfortunate. And in all this funding issue, where is the merit? I don't know. I mean, we need something that the National Science Foundation, I tried to create Rasta for that, but I failed. You know that I failed. It's become a rent-seeking agency now. It's not what it used to be. And but sadly, that's what happens in this country if you don't really have clarity of purpose and if you don't have clarity of thought. But my question is really this: how can we, and this is something that puzzles me, I'm not asking you because you're World Bank, I puzzle myself. Reform only happens when there is a domestic demand for reform. You can say whatever you like, nothing will happen. Reform will happen only. And to give you a case in point, which is very important, reform has happened in this country. A lot of reform happening even now. The mullahs have the power. They'll make any reform they want because they have the dialogue, they have the narrative, they have the power. How can we create or empower others who might want to champion reform? Not necessarily funding. I don't mean funding at all. Sorry, I don't mean funding at all. Don't get me wrong. Ideas. Where are the ideas that are important to reform? For example, as we talk about footprint of the government. Hey, how do we decrease the footprint? Or sludge. Or, for example, monetization. I mean, we are the only country in the world that hasn't monetized salaries. Tell me, isn't that the first thing New Zealand did? Pay for performance, which is monetization. Don't give them a house on the side. Don't give them a World Bank job on the side. Don't give them a contract on the side. Everything happens on the side. Yeah, then we say we are corrupt. Well, corruption is in the system, right? Secondly, for God's sakes, use your assets well. How do we use assets well? It's not just privatization. China has a huge amount of state-owned enterprises. They're doing very well. I don't know. This is a deeper question. How do we make a partnership with domestic reformers?
It's a great question, and I think that as I've said, what we've been trying to do is just build the connections, have conversations, make sure that we are represented and we are encouraging the kind of public dialogue that brings new ideas to the table, especially the ideas of young people, which I think really where the future of this country lies. But I think this is fundamentally the challenge of development. How do you create appetite for reform? And I don't think it's a simple question.
No, it's not simple at all. But I have to take exception to one thing. Why young people? Is this brave new world? Are we going to kill the old people? Or the old people should just go rest and die? I mean, in the World Bank, for example, you're very happy to invite Stiglitz. You're very happy to invite all the old people to give talks and consult and do. Jeffrey Sachs says the UN. SDGs, etc. Why are we against old people here? I think I'm starting a movement for old people in this country because there's a huge amount of youth worship. Is it because the youth are tamer and they don't talk back? Is it because the youth are uninformed? We've already made them human capital devoid. Is it that's the reason we are engaging with the youth, because they won't fight back? They'll just listen calmly, quietly, docilely?
No, I think it's because we have a youth bulge in Pakistan. We have a lot of educated, urban, connected group demographic coming through. I think that group is going to have an enormous influence on the future of Pakistan and an enormously powerful role to play. So I don't think it's about necessarily the quality of the knowledge. It's about the fact that it is an important stakeholder group whose voice is sometimes not fully heard.
Fully agreed. And you will give us some credit for that. Nayab is the one who did the primary research on the demographic dividend, my colleague. Exactly. And she has been talking about the youth bulge and all that all the time. She did the calculation for us, how much growth is required for the youth bulge. Totally agreed. But good. That does not mean that we should exclude the old. I think that's
going. It does not. Oh, I don't think anyone was saying that for a second. I'm old, so I have a vested interest.
I'll give you another example. The government advertisements say exclude the youth, old age. They are excluding old age everywhere, which I think has become a human rights problem. We should talk about that. Anyway, Tobias, we had a great discussion. I don't want to hold you back anymore. You've been very cooperative. You've given us a lot to think about. I think we need to have many more such discussions. I think you should come out into the open, the World Bank, and talk to us openly. Let's not try and create crowds through people, go to a university or whatever. That model doesn't work very well. It's not working. We tried that. It didn't work. My guys were not great. My guys are not honest, so don't even try that. Let's move on to an open dialogue where we can talk to each other. Come and talk to us. We're all Pakistanis, very hospitable people. We like to talk. We like to understand. And at the same time, I think we have to empower our civil society. That's why I'm doing this in this late age. I want to build a civil society that'll talk, chatter. As Sen says, it's the argumentative Indian that's important. Unfortunately, we've developed a docile Pakistani, not an argumentative Pakistani. And I'm trying to make an argumentative Pakistani. I know the government hates me for it, and the government will never invite me anywhere, but I'm happy with that. I'm happy to live with this, that, hey, I don't want to be a part of a government that does not want to listen, that just wants to pronounce. But Tobias, wonderful job. And inshallah, we'll talk again. And inshallah, we'll keep learning from you. I admire your research. The fact that I question it is not that I don't admire your research. As is well known, I was at Chicago. And Chicago, Milton Friedman taught us, if you don't know, or if you don't want to argue, don't become an academic. His philosophy, academics' job is to argue. And this is not we don't repeat old notes, we argue. None of my teachers gave me old notes. They all gave me new stuff. And they were all thinking aloud when they were lecturing, not just giving old notes. So that's the tradition I come from. So sorry, I argue, but it's not malice. It's just pure questioning to learn. Thank you,
No
Tobias.
need for apologies at all. A very interesting, enjoyable conversation. Thank you, Nadeem. It's good to speak to you all.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.